Let's go further in depth now. We're pleased to be joined by famed defense attorney and former Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz. Alan, the author of the ebook Terror Tunnels, the case for Israel's just war against Hamas. Of course, he also blogs for us at Newsmax. Alan, it's so good to have you back here on America's Forum.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on with you.
Alan, in the wake of 9/11, you wrote a column just after 9/11, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, what is your reaction to what Senator Mark Udall had to say yesterday?
Well, there's plenty of hypocrisy, enough to go all around. In the wake of 9/11, everybody wanted torture to be used. Do whatever you can do. We need to stop another 9/11. Public opinion polls in those days showed a vast majority of Americans supporting the use of enhanced interrogation techniques if it would stop a terrorist attack. Even President Clinton got on NPR and said if there were ever a ticking bomb situation, he would do whatever he had to do. And so, times have changed. It's now 13 years since. We haven't had another terrorist attack, and people remember their own views very, very, very differently. The idea of going and prosecuting these folks for doing what the Americans wanted them to do is preposterous. Now, they overdid it, and that's inevitable. You're going to always overdo it. And when you look at the deeply flawed report of the Senate Staff Committee, deeply flawed, we'll get to that in a minute, you see that clearly there's no dispute that they used enhanced interrogation techniques, including torture. Waterboarding, in my view, is torture, unnecessarily, promiscuously, and in far too many cases. But it doesn't mean that if they had used it, waterboarding, only in ticking bomb situations, that the reaction would not have been different. So,
all right, well, let's drill down some on that,
Sure.
Alan. 2.5
Sure.
minutes remain in this segment. You, in an article in a San Francisco newspaper in the wake of 9/11, called for warrants to do this type of enhanced interrogation. Take us through what you proposed.
Well, of course, in those days, we know that torture was being used. It was being used extensively, far too often, far too much. And I said in order to limit the amount of torture that was being used, I myself am opposed to torture, but I recognize that it was being used, we have to limit it to cases where a court would grant a torture warrant based on extraordinary need, ticking bomb situation, an imminent attack on New York Harbor, Chicago, no other way of getting the information, and a court would have to approve it. The President of the United States would have to sign a sworn affidavit indicating the critical need. If that torture warrant had been in place post 9/11, none of this that was reported in this Democratic staff report would have happened, because no court would approve warrants in those situations. Perhaps the Sheikh Khalid Mohammed waterboarding would have been permitted, but none of the others would have been permitted. So I think the case for accountability, when we do extraordinary things like waterboarding or any other kind of torture, there has to be accountability for it. Right now, we don't know who authorized it. We don't know who approved it. You certainly can't blame the low-ranking people in the CIA. What we need is accountability and visibility, and a torture warrant would give that kind of accountability and visibility in extraordinary situations.
Only about 30 seconds remain, Alan, in this segment. The timing factor on a ticking time bomb situation, how quickly do you envision a warrant being granted?
Well, first, you can get them instantaneously. I've seen them. You can get them on telephone. You can get them by email. Second, in extraordinary emergency situations, you get it after the fact, not before the fact. I mean, if you know that a bomb's going to go off in 3 hours, you don't wait. And, of course, there are better techniques for eliciting information, but they take time. So
and speaking of time, Alan, we have to yield it back to our friends who help us pay the bills. You graciously consented to stay with us through the break.
Sure.
When we come back, we'll talk more about this proposal and what is done worldwide by our allies and perhaps by our enemies. America's Forum continues here on Newsmax TV. Let's continue our conversation with Alan Dershowitz, the noted defense attorney. Alan, again, thank you for the time.
Sure.
Dick Cheney's angry. He said the way we got the information was done to protect the United States. You set the post-9/11 scene in the previous segment pretty well. Why the argument that so many are making about those who are terrorists, not from a traditional nation state, not from signatories to Geneva Conventions or other rules of war internationally, receiving the virtual protection of the U.S. Constitution and protection for citizens, usually reserved for citizens?
Well, people will, first of all, be shocked to hear this, but the United States Constitution does not prohibit torture. The United States Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision about 10 years ago, ruled that the Fifth Amendment only prohibits the use of evidence obtained by torture from being introduced in a criminal trial, but it doesn't, the Fifth Amendment at least, doesn't prohibit torture itself. And so we've had many cases in the United States where the police have used torture to elicit confessions, or in one case in Florida, to find the whereabouts of a kidnap victim. And the courts have approved that use of torture. Of course, we have a statute now on the books, I think passed in 1994, that does prohibit the use of torture, but it's not a constitutional rule. Does it apply to non-citizens? No. There we have to look at Geneva Conventions and international accords that we're signed onto that prohibit the use of torture. And of course, the Bush administration said that waterboarding isn't torture. It is torture. There's no doubt that it is. It's designed to elicit fear of drowning. It could produce drowning. And I think we should call it what it is, which is torture. The question that I think most Americans would have different answers on is if we had a ticking bomb situation and we only had 3 or 4 hours to locate the bomb, and we had a person in custody who knew where the bomb was, would we torture him to make him take us to the bomb? Now, you don't believe anything under torture, but if he takes you to the bomb, as happened in the Philippines some years ago where somebody was tortured into showing where bombs were hidden that were going to be used to blow up airplanes, that's a self-proving use of torture. And I think Americans would disagree fundamentally about whether torture should be used in those situations. I bet a majority would say it should be.
Well, let's talk about, you're a big friend of Israel. Israel has to deal with the realities of a hostile situation daily. Do the Israelis utilize waterboarding? What do they use in terms of enhanced interrogation techniques?
Well, mostly they use the long-term interrogation techniques. But, of course, in some situations, they have resorted to torture. And the Supreme Court of Israel outlawed the use of torture and in a footnote said, if you ever did have a real ticking bomb situation and if an intelligence agent used torture, then maybe he could raise the defense of necessity, that it had to be done, and maybe he'd be excused. They left it open and vague. The Senate did cite that opinion in its report, but Israel today, at least under law, does not use torture.
Less than 2 minutes remain. Our parent website, Newsmax.com, has this interesting headline, we'll have it on the screen in a minute, saying that President Obama is working hard to clear out Guantanamo Bay, with a dozen prisoners released since Thanksgiving. Alan, is this the right decision?
It's, again, a very hard question. What do you do with people who you can't convict of crime because the evidence against them comes from undercover agents whose cover we don't want to blow, but who have admitted and acknowledged that they will go out and do it again? Should we have some form of preventive detention? That's a very hard question. And I noticed that the Obama administration is not planning to release all these people, perhaps to move them to supermaxes or to give them to other countries. But how you deal with the people who are extraordinarily dangerous, self-admitted terrorists, who you can't convict of crimes, is a very difficult question. What we need is nuance in considering this, not the kind of yes or no that the Senate report came up with. We need a little bit of balance, a recognition that there are arguments on both sides of these issues.
And there are questions that continue. For example, the use of enhanced interrogation techniques as opposed to the use of drones, how you effectively fight a war against a non-nation state and stay true to your principles and also respect international law. Questions that we hope to talk about more as our time continues together. Unfortunately, right now, Alan Dershowitz, this particular segment is done. You heard what our good friend, Mr. Dershowitz, had to say. He calls waterboarding torture. But he also points out that the Constitution does not specifically prohibit that kind of endeavor. What's your take on it? Why don't you tweet me at NewsmaxTV, #AmericasForum. The conversation has been so compelling that Alan Dershowitz has graciously said he'd stay with us for a couple of additional minutes. Alan, thanks so much. Let's get to what I set up right before the break. Enhanced interrogation techniques, non-lethal, as opposed to drone strikes with the possibility of lethality for collateral damage, so to speak. Isn't there a case for, you call it torture, but a lot of us call it enhanced interrogation?
Well, it's interesting that the American Civil Liberties Union took the position that before you can target somebody with a drone, you have to have a warrant. And yet they oppose the warrant requirement for torture, seeming to suggest that torture is worse than killing innocent people in drone strikes. Look, we have a continuum of violence. Drone strikes kill people, torture hurts people, terrorism, of course, kills people as well. We have to have sensible discussions about these things, not just, oh, it's torture, it must be terrible. Oh, it's non-judicial killing, it must be terrible. It's a lot better than what we did in the Second World War, which was to carpet bomb Dresden and carpet bomb Tokyo. Today, we're selectively killing people with some collateral damage, some innocent people, and it's a process that we have to go through. We have to think about what's the least worst way of achieving the results we're entitled to achieve, and that is stopping terrorists from attacking our people. Israel confronts that every day. We're confronting that on a more regular basis. The Senate report does not contribute to that debate because it's polemical, it's partisan, it's incomplete, and it was unprofessional.
And speaking of that report, again, Alan Dershowitz, we thank you for your time. And of course, Alan is the author of the ebook Terror Tunnels, Israel's Just War Against Hamas. Alan Dershowitz, as always, we thank you for your time and for your analysis.